It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to get away from the grind of life. My name's Lucas, and I'm 32 years old. I'd been working non-stop in Paris for months, and my mind was frayed. A friend of mine, Claire, had suggested a cabin in the middle of nowhere in the French countryside, near a tiny village called Auzit. It was isolated, quiet, no one would bother me. Just what I needed. The cabin, a stone cottage, was small but charming. I found it through a listing online and thought it would be perfect for some much-needed solitude. The owner, an older man named Henri, had been kind enough to leave the key under a rock by the porch. That's how remote this place was. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even though the location was stunning, the silence was almost oppressive. It was peaceful, but in a way that felt too still. I arrived on a Friday evening, and as I unpacked my things, I couldn't help but notice the strange quietness around me. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the wind was barely enough to ruffle the trees. The sun was setting fast, and I realized I'd arrived just as dusk began to settle in. The cabin itself had a certain weathered charm, with a stone fireplace that was the centerpiece of the living room, a wooden beam across the ceiling, and old furniture that seemed out of place in time. There were no modern conveniences here, just the basics. A small kitchen, a wooden table, a couple of armchairs by the fire. It was perfect for someone who wanted to disconnect. The first night went by quietly. I spent the evening unpacking, making a small meal, and reading a book by the fire. It was relaxing, just what I needed to unwind. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not from a dream, but from something more unsettling. There was a noise light at first, a faint scraping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling. But then it happened again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, trying to place the sound. It was coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I stood up, pulled on my jacket, and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen. The moonlight outside was dim, but I could still make out the shape of the forest surrounding the cabin. The trees were thick, tall, and black against the sky. The scraping sound came again. This time, it was clearer. It sounded like something was dragging along the ground. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I walked around the cabin, trying to trace the sound. It stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was just some animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer, right by the back door of the cabin. I shined the flashlight in that direction. There was nothing there. I felt a twinge of unease, but I told myself it was just my nerves. It had been a long day of travel, and the isolation of the cabin was playing tricks on my mind. I decided to head back inside, lock the door, and try to get some sleep. The next day, I decided to take a walk into the surrounding woods. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the forest was quiet but peaceful. The birds were singing, the leaves rustling underfoot as I made my way through the trees. The forest seemed endless, stretching for miles in all directions. There were no signs of anyone else around. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived in Auzit the day before. I kept walking, enjoying the solitude, until I stumbled upon something that caught my attention. It was a set of footprints, large and heavy, leading off the main trail into the deeper part of the woods. They didn't look like the prints of any animal I knew. They were too large for a deer and too round, almost human-like, though the shape of the toes was off, elongated and strangely distorted. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the footprints. They led me deeper into the woods, twisting and turning through the thick trees. After about half an hour of walking, the prints stopped abruptly in front of a large stone outcrop. It looked like a natural barrier, a rock wall rising from the earth. I stood there for a moment, confused. The footprints just ended. There was no sign of where they had gone after that. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to add up. My head started to spin a little. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine and turned back toward the cabin. I didn't feel like venturing any deeper into the woods after that. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I tried to distract myself with a book, some music, and even some light chores around the cabin. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone. The thought kept creeping into my mind. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustling outside or a faint movement from the trees, but whenever I went to check, there was nothing there. That night, as I sat by the fire, I felt a sudden urge to check the back door again. I hadn't heard anything strange, but something told me to do it. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. I shined the light around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the yard and the trees. That's when I saw it. Something dark and fast moving through the trees at the edge of my property. It was unlike anything I had seen before, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. The flashlight beam barely caught it before it vanished into the night. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with what I'd just seen. It didn't make sense. The movement was too strange, too erratic. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and sat down in front of the fire, my mind spinning with thoughts of what could be out there. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone at that cabin, and the strange noises, the footprints, and the dark shape I saw in the trees were too much to ignore. I packed up quickly, too quickly, and by noon, I was on my way back to Paris. It was a long drive back, and as I passed through the small village of Auzit, I saw Henri again. He was sitting outside his little shop, waving as I drove by. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice friendly. I hesitated for a moment, but then I nodded. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't feel like I was telling the whole truth. Just needed to head back early. It wasn't what I expected. Henri gave me a small smile. "It can be quiet out there," he said, "but some people like it that way." I nodded and drove off, not looking back. As I left the village behind and headed toward Paris, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I'd never go back to that cabin, never venture into those woods again. Whatever had been there, I didn't want to know. I arrived back in Paris by evening. The bustling city lights a stark contrast to the eerie quiet I'd left behind. I had almost forgotten about the strange occurrences, until one night, weeks later, I found something in the pocket of the jacket I'd worn to the cabin. It was a small, frayed piece of fabric, torn and dirty, like something that had been ripped from the hem of a coat. It was old, the kind of thing that would have come from something far longer worn out in the woods. I stared at it for a long time, and the realization hit me. It hadn't been just an animal. Whatever had followed me that night wasn't from this world. But I would never be able to prove it. The evidence was gone, and with it, the mystery. All I had left was that strange, frayed piece of fabric, a silent reminder of something I could never explain. And that was the last time I ever went near the French countryside again. It was early November when I arrived at the cabin. The roads had been bad for the past week. Snow and ice had blanketed the higher elevations, and the forecast called for more of the same. I didn't mind. There was something about the isolation that I liked. I had rented the place for the next 2 weeks. Just me, a stack of books, and the silence. I was ready for some time alone after months of chaotic work, constant meetings, and barely having time to sleep. This was my escape. The cabin sat on a narrow, winding road in the northern part of New Mexico, just outside the small town of Tres Piedras. It wasn't much, just a one-story structure with a slanted roof, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a movie. It was surrounded by pine trees and overlooked a small valley where the Rio Grande twisted through the landscape. The cabin had been built decades ago by a man who had long since passed, and its rough-hewn logs and weathered exterior gave it a look that said it had seen many seasons come and go. I parked my truck, the tires crunching on the thin layer of snow that had settled over the gravel driveway, and unloaded my bags. The air was cold, biting at my skin with an intensity that felt sharper than it had back in town. I'd been expecting that. The mountain air had a way of doing that. Still, I had to admit, standing there with the snow swirling around and the sun barely peeking through the thick cloud cover, It felt like I was stepping into another world. The key to the cabin was hidden under a rock, like the owner had said it would be. I found it without trouble and unlocked the front door. The hinges creaked in protest, and a sharp, musty smell hit me the second I stepped inside. It was nothing overwhelming, just the kind of odor that came with an old building that hadn't been lived in regularly. I flipped on the lights, and the place came alive with the soft hum of the overhead bulbs. Inside, the cabin was simple. A living area with a stone fireplace on one wall, a few mismatched chairs scattered around, and a low coffee table in the middle. A rug lay in front of the fireplace, worn but still colorful. The kitchen was small, just a few cabinets, an old stove, and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A hallway led to 2 small bedrooms. I knew the cabin wasn't much, but it was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, secluded, and far away from everything. I unpacked my things, setting up my books and clothes in one of the bedrooms, the one facing the woods. I liked the idea of waking up with the view of the trees. The second bedroom, with its single bed and a narrow window, would be used for storage. I had no intention of venturing outside until I was ready to leave. The temperature was dropping fast, and the sky was overcast. Felt like a storm was coming. The first couple of days were exactly what I wanted. I woke up late, read my books, made simple meals, and went to bed early. The cold outside didn't bother me. In fact, it made the cabin feel even more like a refuge. There was no phone signal, no internet, just the quiet hum of isolation. It was peaceful, but by the third night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint right away. It was just small things, sounds that didn't seem to belong. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But then I started hearing something like scratching at the door. I would get up, check, and nothing would be there. The snow had been falling heavily that day, and there were no tracks leading up to the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind again. The next night, it happened again, scratching at the door. This time, I was a little more unsettled. I stood in the living room, listening, trying to figure out what it could be. The trees around the cabin creaked and moaned in the wind, but this was different. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the porch and the snow-covered ground for any sign of what might have made the sound. There was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no animals. Just the snow, untouched and still. I closed the door quickly, heart racing, and locked it behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Scratching. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, where the windows looked out into the forest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, looking for food. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't feel like it was something as simple as that. I kept thinking back to the stories the locals had told me when I stopped in town for supplies. Old legends about the area, things about skinwalkers, strange figures in the woods, and people who'd gone missing and never come back. I had brushed them off as superstition, but now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside to check the surroundings. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky had cleared up, but everything was covered in a fresh layer of white. No footprints, not a sign of anything that could explain the noises. I spent the rest of the day in a strange mix of unease and determination. If it was just an animal, I could handle it. If it was something else, though, I didn't know what to do. I tried to distract myself with books and cooking, but the cabin felt different now. There was a sense of tension, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I spent hours staring out the windows, trying to catch sight of something, anything, that might explain what was going on. On the 5th night, things escalated. The scratching started again, but this time it was louder. It wasn't just at the door or the windows. It was all around the cabin, as though something was moving just outside the walls, clawing its way around. The noise was constant, relentless, like a dozen unseen creatures were pacing the perimeter. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, determined to get to the bottom of it. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight cutting through the snow. I swept it across the ground, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The scratching didn't stop, but it was coming from every direction. Then, as I moved the flashlight toward the back of the cabin, I saw something. A figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, standing motionless in the shadows between the trees. I froze. My first thought was that it was a person, but there was something wrong about it. The shape was wrong. It didn't move like a person. I couldn't tell if it was just the shadow or if it was something else. Before I could even think about what to do next, it turned, its head jerking unnaturally, and disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait. I ran back inside the cabin, locked the door, and didn't leave again until morning. That night, I didn't hear the scratching. The next few days were eerily quiet. I kept the lights on and stayed close to the windows, watching for any sign of the figure I'd seen. The weather had turned colder, and the roads were becoming impassable. I was stuck. There was no way out. Then, on the final night of my stay, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. Slowly, I pulled myself out of bed, heart hammering in my chest. The window was covered with frost, but I could see the faintest silhouette outside, moving just beyond the glass. I stood there, holding my breath, staring at the shadow. It was the same shape, the same figure, but this time it didn't disappear. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward me. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I made my way to the door. I didn't know if I was going to make it out alive. By morning, the figure was gone, and when I checked the window, there were no signs that anyone or anything had been there. The frost had melted, and there were no scratches, no marks, nothing. I left the cabin that day. I didn't come back for years. The first thing I noticed was the cold, sharp air that hit me the moment I stepped out of the truck. The cabin was barely visible through the dense trees, swallowed up by the snow-covered forest, but I had been here before. It wasn't the first time I'd come to hunt this remote part of northern Michigan. It had always been peaceful, quiet, just the kind of place I needed to clear my head. This year was different, though. I had been feeling uneasy the last few days, like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the long drive, maybe it was the way the trees looked darker than usual, but something about the place felt wrong. The cabin was an old structure, built by my grandfather back in the 70s. He had left it to me after he passed a few years ago. It wasn't much, just a small, single-story wooden building with a fireplace, a couple of rooms, and a small kitchen. It had been through a lot of winters, and you could see it in the way the wood creaked in the cold and the way the roof had started to sag. But it had character. It was a place that felt like home, even if it was isolated. I had always enjoyed the solitude. I carried my gear inside, the weight of the rifle over my shoulder reminding me why I was here. Hunting. That was the reason I came up every year. To get away from the noise of everyday life, to focus on something simple. Just the rifle, the trees, and the silence. It was already late afternoon when I set up. The sun was sinking low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The temperature had dropped quickly, and I could feel the bite of the winter wind seeping through the cracks in the cabin's walls. I started a fire in the stove, the crackling of the wood filling the space with a warm glow, and sat down at the small wooden table to unpack my supplies. The wind outside howled, rattling the cabin's old windows, and I noticed the stillness that had fallen over the place. It wasn't just the usual silence of being deep in the woods. It was something else. It felt like the air was holding its breath. There was no movement, no animals rustling in the underbrush, no birds calling in the distance, just that unnerving stillness. I shrugged it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe a storm was coming in, or the weather was just acting up. Still, the feeling of unease didn't go away. I decided to go check the trail cam I had set up near the edge of the forest earlier that morning. It was the perfect time, just before dusk when the animals would be most active. I grabbed my rifle, slipped into my boots, and headed out. The snow crunched under my feet as I walked through the trees, the cold biting into my face. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't enough to deter me. The camera was about half a mile down the trail. I had walked this path many times, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. What did make me uneasy was the absolute quiet. The wind had started to fade, but everything else seemed to be still. When I reached the trail cam, I knelt down to check the footage. The screen flickered to life, but what I saw made my stomach drop. The footage was strange, like it was jumping and warping, but I could make out a figure. A dark shape moving in the background, too large to be a deer or any other animal I had seen before. It seemed to be walking upright like a person, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it wasn't quite in sync with the world around it. My heart rate picked up. I didn't know what I was looking at, but something told me it wasn't something I should be out here alone to confront. I quickly turned the camera off, the sudden realization that something wasn't right settling in the pit of my stomach. I stood up and started to head back, my eyes darting around the trees, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That's when I heard it, a rustle like something large moving through the brush, just off the trail. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. The sound was deliberate, almost too calculated. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My breath came in short, quick bursts as I slowly turned my head towards the noise. Nothing, just the dark, snow-covered forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't wait around to find out. I started walking faster, my pace quickening into a near run as the noise seemed to follow me. I didn't turn to look, but I could feel it, whatever it was, getting closer. The air felt heavier, the wind now howling in my ears as I made my way back to the cabin. When I finally made it inside, I slammed the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stood in the small entryway, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't explain it. The noise, the figure on the trail cam, the feeling of being watched, it didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves. Maybe I had been out too long in the cold. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the thought that something was out there in those woods. And it wasn't something I understood. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down, but I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. I hadn't seen it clearly, but I could still feel the weight of it, that strange wrongness to its movement. It felt too big to be a man, too unnatural to be an animal. It felt like it was something that wasn't supposed to be out there, and I was alone. As night fell, the wind picked up again, this time louder than before. It howled around the cabin, rattling the windows with an almost angry force. I kept the lights low, the fire crackling in the corner as I tried to stay calm. But then I heard something that stopped me cold. A knock, soft, deliberate, came from the door. I froze. Couldn't be. It was too late for anyone to be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I hadn't seen anyone for days. I grabbed my rifle from the corner, my hands trembling as I stood in the dim light of the cabin. Another knock, this time louder, followed by a scraping sound. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't supposed to be here. I couldn't just open the door. I couldn't risk it. So I waited, listening to the sound of the wind and the scrape of something against the wood. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Maybe it was minutes, maybe hours. But eventually the sounds stopped. The knocking, the scraping, all of it just stopped. I didn't go to the door. I stayed in my chair, eyes darting around the room, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But nothing happened. The house was quiet again, too quiet. I spent the rest of the night in that cabin, too terrified to leave, too paranoid to sleep. I stayed by the fire, rifle in hand, listening to the wind batter the walls. I don't know when the sound stopped. I don't know if it was just the storm passing, or if I had imagined the whole thing. But when the sun came up the next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking, and made my way out of the cabin. The forest was still and silent, as if the night had never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, that something had been watching me. As I drove away, the sun rising behind me, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was small and distant, barely visible through the trees. I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. It was a Thursday when I decided to take the drive up to the cabin. I didn't have any particular reason for needing to be there, just a long weekend to myself. The kind of thing you do when you're feeling tired, overwhelmed, and need some space away from the usual chaos of life. I wasn't running from anything, not really, but the idea of quiet, of nothing but the sounds of trees swaying in the wind and the occasional creak of wood settling in a house that hadn't been used in months, felt like the kind of reset I needed. The cabin was in a secluded area, far from any neighbors or towns. In fact, it was a good 2 hours north of where I lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, out in the middle of the forest where the road seemed to get narrower the further you went. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading up to it, the rain had started. The kind of rain that didn't just drizzle, but came down in sheets, as if the clouds were emptying themselves out over the mountains. It wasn't too heavy at first, but it was constant, a low hum against the roof of my car. My headlights cut through the mist and trees, but only just barely. The cabin was small, a 2-story affair with wood paneling that was starting to show its age. The paint was chipped, and there were a few boards that seemed like they had warped in the weather over time. I had inherited it from my uncle, someone I barely knew but who had passed away a year ago. It wasn't much, but it was comfortable enough for one person, and that's all I needed. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires as I pulled up to the front porch. I took a moment before getting out of the car, my eyes scanning the surroundings. It was late afternoon now, the sun long gone, and the rain was coming down harder. The trees around me loomed like silent sentinels, their dark branches swaying in the wind. I could hear the rush of water somewhere nearby, the sound of a stream, I assumed. The cabin didn't look like much from the outside, but that was the point. I didn't want anything too fancy, something simple where I could unwind and just be. No distractions. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and made my way inside. The door creaked when I opened it, the smell of wood and dust immediately filling my nose. I flicked the light switch, and the dim light of a single bulb lit up the small living room. The furniture was old, the couch faded from years of use, and the fireplace in the corner was cold, but it was homey in its own way. There was something oddly comforting about how untouched the place felt, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. After tossing my things onto the couch, I began to unpack. The kitchen was small, but functional, and I started putting together a simple meal, pasta, just something to fill my stomach. The rain picked up outside, the sound intensifying against the cabin's roof, the steady drumming almost like a lullaby. The first night passed quietly. The rain didn't stop. I sat by the fire for a while, the crackling of the logs mixing with the sound of the storm outside. It was peaceful. So peaceful, in fact, that I almost forgot how strange it felt to be alone. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty, but filled with the sound of my own breathing, the occasional creak of wood as the place settled, and the rhythmic beating of the rain. But then, around midnight, I heard something that wasn't the rain. It was subtle at first, a faint scratching sound. I paused, listening. Came from upstairs. Just a faint scraping, like something lightly brushing against the floor. I sat still, waiting to see if it would come again, but nothing followed. I chalked it up to the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the side of the house. It wasn't uncommon for the trees around here to make strange noises in the wind. It wasn't anything to be worried about. I went to bed soon after that, pulling the thick blankets up to my chin and drifting off to sleep. The house felt warm, despite the coldness of the storm outside, and I quickly lost track of time as I sank deeper into the darkness. When I woke up the next morning, it was still raining, but now it was heavier, the kind of rain that brought with it a thick fog that hung in the air. The windows were streaked with droplets, and the world outside was reduced to a blur of gray. I got up and stretched, heading for the kitchen to make some coffee. The scent of the brewing coffee filled the cabin as I sat down at the small wooden table, sipping slowly. The storm didn't seem like it was going to let up anytime soon. I spent most of the day inside, reading, watching the rain, and just thinking. I didn't have anywhere to be, so I let myself sink into the calm of the cabin. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something. It was subtle at first, but it felt like the air had changed. The sound of the rain, which had been soothing at first, now felt almost oppressive. There was a heaviness to it that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the storm. It was the feeling in the cabin itself, as though the walls were pressing in on me. And then, just after dinner, I heard it again, the faint scratching noise from upstairs. This time it was louder, more deliberate. I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. The noise was unmistakable, coming from just above the living room. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was something moving. I set my bowl down and stood, my heart thumping in my chest. The storm outside was so loud now that I could barely hear anything else. But the noise upstairs was clear, like a dragging sound, as though something was being pulled slowly across the floor. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I moved toward the stairs. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, listening. The cabin was quiet now, the noise having stopped as suddenly as it had started. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something was actually up there. But the scratching hadn't been in my head. It had been real. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen, holding it tightly in my hand. The thought of going upstairs was making my stomach twist, but I couldn't just ignore it. Something was off. It had to be. My mind was racing, and I could feel the tension in my muscles as I slowly made my way up the stairs. The first thing I noticed when I reached the top was that the door to the bedroom at the end of the hall was ajar. It hadn't been open when I came in earlier. I was sure of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached the door. My breath felt shallow, and my grip tightened on the flashlight. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. It was exactly as I had left it. Bed unmade, a few scattered things on the floor, but there was something different. The air felt colder here, almost unnaturally so. I moved further into the room, shining the flashlight around. It swept over the walls, the bed, the closet. Everything seemed normal, but then I saw it. A faint trail of what looked like dirt or mud leading across the floor toward the far corner of the room. I followed the trail, my mind racing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The trail led to the window, where the curtains were drawn tightly shut. But when I reached the window, I noticed something odd. The latch was loose. It had been locked when I arrived. Now it was hanging slightly open. I pushed the curtains aside, peering out into the rain. The world outside was obscured by the heavy fog and downpour, but I saw nothing that could explain the trail inside. The trees were a blur in the storm, nothing moving. I closed the window and locked it again, my mind spinning. There was no logical explanation for what had happened. The door hadn't opened on its own. No one had come into the cabin. The mud or dirt, it didn't make sense. I spent the rest of the evening in a sort of heightened awareness, constantly on edge. The rain continued, relentless. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every shift in the air made me jump. But nothing else happened. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was still overcast, but the heavy rain had stopped. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the air had cleared with the weather. I packed my things slowly, taking extra time to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything. The cabin felt different now, like it had become a place I no longer wanted to be. I left that morning, locking the door behind me. The drive back down the narrow road was peaceful, but in my mind, I kept replaying the events of the past 2 days. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Whatever it was that happened in that cabin, it wasn't supernatural. It was just strange, too strange to ignore. But I had come out the other side of it, and that was enough for me. I didn't go back to the cabin for a long time after that. But when I finally did, the door was still locked, the dust undisturbed. Everything seemed just as I had left it. Nothing else had ever happened, and that, in itself, was enough to give me peace. The last time I visited Grandma's cabin, I was just a kid. I don't even remember the exact age, maybe 10 or 11, but I know it was a place I thought of as magical at the time, full of mystery and a sort of unexplainable charm. The smell of wood smoke, pine needles, and old leather would always fill the air. There were always stories too, things that Grandma would never quite explain in full but left hints and whispers hanging like the fog that would roll in across the lake. The cabin was tucked away deep in the forest, a good 2 hours outside of town, where cell service didn't work and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was isolated, just the kind of place that had a strange stillness to it. And though I hadn't been back in nearly 2 decades, something about the place pulled me in. Maybe it was nostalgia, or the fact that Grandma had passed away a few months earlier, but whatever the reason, I found myself driving down that same winding road once again. It was late September when I decided to make the trip. The air had a crispness to it, but there was still the occasional warmth of the fading summer lingering in the atmosphere. My old truck rattled as I made my way down the dirt road, the trees thick and dark, the leaves already starting to turn shades of red and gold. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, though I was used to driving this road when I was younger. The road, a small dirt path lined with trees, seemed just as it always had been, narrow, rough, and barely traveled. As I pulled up to the cabin, my heart sank a little. It looked exactly how I remembered, though older and more weathered. The paint was peeling from the wooden walls, the roof sagging in a way that made the whole place feel tired. The porch steps creaked loudly as I climbed them, a sound that sent a shiver through me, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of memories. Inside, the cabin was just as empty and quiet as it always had been. The smell of musty old wood and stale air filled my lungs as I took in the familiar surroundings. The small kitchen, with its old stove that always seemed to be on the verge of breaking down. The living room, with the worn-out couch that Grandma used to sit on for hours, knitting or reading her old books. Everything was in its place, and yet it felt wrong, like it had been abandoned for much longer than just a few months. I set my bag down on the wooden table by the door and took a deep breath. The place was a mess, but it was the kind of mess that came from neglect rather than carelessness. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, and the windows were streaked with grime, making the sunlight that filtered through seem dim and distant. There was something unsettling about it all. Grandma's cabin was always full of life, even when she was the only one there. But now it felt like the life had been drained from the place. I spent the first few hours just cleaning up, wiping down counters, sweeping the floors. It wasn't much, but it helped settle the unease that had started creeping in. The cabin might have been run down, but it was still standing, and it was still mine now, at least in a way. The sun had started to set by the time I finished tidying up, and I figured I'd go take a walk around the property to clear my mind. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, the trees packed tightly together, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the earth giving way with each step as I walked deeper into the forest. I had always loved these woods, but tonight, they felt different. The air seemed heavier, like something was watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves or the quietness of the place. I walked for what felt like hours, the shadows growing longer and the temperature dropping. The rustling of the leaves underfoot was the only sound that accompanied me, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the normal crunch of fallen leaves. It was softer, almost too soft, like something else was walking alongside me. But every time I stopped and turned around, I saw nothing but trees. Eventually, I came across an old, half-collapsed shed I didn't remember ever seeing before. The roof had caved in, and the walls were barely standing. But something about it felt important, like it had been waiting for me to find it. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, pushing aside some overgrown branches to get a better look. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The floor was littered with old tools, broken wooden crates, and discarded bits of metal. But it was the old leather bag sitting in the corner that caught my eye. It looked almost brand new, despite the state of everything else around it. I moved cautiously toward it and crouched down to open the bag. Inside were several old, yellowed papers, all tightly folded. I picked one up and unfolded it carefully, my heart racing as I saw the handwriting on it. It was Grandma's handwriting, though different somehow, more erratic, more frantic. The paper was filled with notes and scribbles, none of them making much sense. Words like, "Never go into the woods at night," "They're not what they seem," and "Watch for the eyes" were scattered across the page, half crossed out and rewritten over and over. A chill ran down my spine. What was this? What had Grandma known about the woods that she never told me? My hands shook as I rifled through the rest of the papers, finding more of the same. The notes were filled with warnings, cryptic thoughts, and instructions about things I couldn't understand. I couldn't make sense of it all, but I felt a growing sense of urgency, like I had to get out of there before something happened. I stuffed the papers back into the bag, grabbed it, and hurried out of the shed. The sun was long gone, and the only light left was the dim glow of the moon, filtering through the branches above. As I rushed back toward the cabin, I kept hearing that soft, unnatural rustling in the woods behind me. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but the feeling of being followed, of something just out of sight, clung to me like a shadow. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath heavy in my chest. I locked all the windows and doors, pulling the curtains tight. It felt ridiculous to be so scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there in the woods, and it was waiting. I spent the rest of the night inside, pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of the papers and the strange feeling that was suffocating me. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin walls, made me jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, but when I checked, nothing was there. By morning, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. But the unease didn't leave. It had only grown stronger, a constant presence in the pit of my stomach. I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with whatever was out there lurking in the woods. As I packed my things and headed for the door, I noticed something strange. The front porch steps, which I had heard creaking the night before, were now silent. Too silent. I looked down at them, my heart racing. The boards had been disturbed, scratched as though someone had been pacing back and forth there in the dark. That was when I heard it again, the rustling in the trees, but this time it wasn't far off. It was close, so close I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. I turned quickly, looking out into the woods, but there was nothing. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag, slammed the door behind me, and ran for the truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Something was watching me. Something still waits in those woods. And the papers, I've kept them hidden away. Maybe it's best that I never fully understand what Grandma was warning me about. Maybe it's better not to know. I don't plan on going back there again. It was the end of August when I finally arrived at the cabin. My name's Lucas, and I was 29 at the time. I had just gone through a pretty tough year. Lots of stress, some personal stuff that was hard to shake off, and my therapist suggested I take some time off to decompress. It sounded like a good idea, so I rented a cabin in the woods up near a small, quiet town called Riverside. The plan was to spend a few weeks in isolation with no distractions. No internet, no phone service. Just me, the trees, and whatever peace I could find in the silence. I'd never been one for cabins in the woods, not for any particular reason, but it had always seemed kind of cliché. Still, it was what was available, and I had no better options. It wasn't a huge cabin, more like a small, modest place tucked away behind a line of old pine trees. The kind of place you see in movies where someone is supposed to have a life-changing experience or find themselves. I didn't think much of it at first. I just needed a place to unwind. The drive there was long, and the roads were winding and narrow, especially as I got farther from the town. I passed a couple of scattered houses, but everything felt isolated. The trees were thick on both sides of the road, stretching up to the sky like towering sentinels, blocking out the sun in some places. The further I went, the fewer signs of human life there seemed to be. The cabin itself was a one-story wooden structure, built right into the side of a small hill. A worn, gravel driveway led up to it, and there was a small front porch with a rocking chair that creaked in the wind. The first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was how quiet it was. Like really quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. It felt almost unnatural, like the trees were holding their breath. The inside of the cabin was what you'd expect. Wooden floors, simple furniture, a small kitchen area with a fridge and a stove, a few shelves with books and knickknacks. There were 2 small bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a living room with a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air had a musty smell to it, but that wasn't surprising for a place this old. I spent the first couple of days settling in. The weather was cool, crisp, and everything around me was green, rich and full of life. I had a few books with me, mostly to keep me busy, but I found myself doing a lot of thinking. The stillness of the place seemed to open up parts of my mind I wasn't used to visiting. It was like my thoughts were louder here. The wind would whistle through the trees, and the distant sound of a creek running somewhere nearby would drift in, but otherwise, there was no sound at all. It was eerie in a way, but I told myself that was part of the charm. On the 3rd day, I decided to take a walk around the area. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, and there was a small trail that led down the hill to a creek. I grabbed a jacket and set off, hoping to get a little exercise and clear my head. The trail was narrow but well-worn, like it had been used regularly by someone before me. I figured it was just another one of those things you find in a place like this, a forgotten pathway. The deeper I walked into the woods, the more I noticed how quiet it was. The normal forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves were barely there. The only thing I could hear was my own footsteps on the dirt path. It felt like the woods were holding something back. I shrugged it off and kept going, but the farther I went, the more unsettled I became. The trees were thick around me, and the light barely made it through the canopy. It was strange, like everything was darker, even though it was still midday. As I followed the trail, I came across something unusual. It was a large tree, but what caught my attention was the way the ground around it was disturbed. The soil had been dug up like someone had been searching for something. There were deep gouges in the earth, and the branches of the tree were broken, as if they had been pulled down with force. I took a step closer to investigate, but as I did, I felt a sharp shiver run down my spine. There was something off about the spot, something I couldn't quite place. My instinct told me to leave it alone, so I stepped back and decided to head back to the cabin. That night, I tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the tree. I wasn't someone who normally jumped to conclusions or believed in weird superstitions, but there was something about the way the forest felt, something that didn't sit right. The following days were a blur of trying to shake off the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I kept my walks short, sticking closer to the cabin, but every time I went outside, the silence seemed thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. On the 6th day, I decided to go for another walk, but this time, I was determined to push past the unease. I figured I was just overthinking things. I needed to stop being so paranoid. The weather had shifted slightly, with a light drizzle starting to fall as I left the cabin. The air was thick and smelled like wet earth, which, if anything, seemed to add to the weight of the quiet. I kept walking, telling myself I was being stupid for thinking something was wrong. That was when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they might have been from some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the size and shape of them didn't match anything I recognized. They were large, almost too big to be from any common animal, and the way they were spaced apart, it was like whoever had walked here was moving at a strange pace. There was something unnatural about it. I knelt down to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. The prints weren't just normal footprints, they were deep, almost as if they had been made by something much heavier than a person or animal. And they were too close together, too precise. It was almost as if whoever made them had been dragging something. The deeper I looked, the more I could see that the earth around the prints had been disturbed, like something had been dragged through the forest recently. I stood up quickly, feeling a wave of panic rise in my chest. My heart was racing, and my breath felt shallow. I wanted to turn around and head back to the cabin, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the feeling that I needed to know what was going on. I followed the trail for a little longer, keeping a careful distance from the footprints. The trail led me deeper into the woods, and soon I was no longer following any marked path. I was simply walking through the trees, my feet crunching on the wet leaves and underbrush. The further I went, the more unsettling the forest felt. The trees seemed taller here, and the undergrowth was thick and tangled. It felt as though the woods were closing in around me. That's when I saw it. It was a clearing, small and almost hidden, surrounded by thick trees. In the center of the clearing, there was a pile of old, broken branches. But what stood out the most was the shape in the middle of it. A dark figure. It was hunched over, and at first I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was far too large, too wrong to be anything natural. I froze. My mind raced, and my heart was pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, and it didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the fear had paralyzed me. It wasn't until a few minutes passed that the figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward me. I didn't recognize it at first, but then I saw the eyes. They were too wide, too empty, and they seemed to gleam in the dull light of the overcast sky. It didn't look human, not really. Its face was gaunt. The skin stretched tight over its bones, and its hair, if you could even call it that, was thin and straggly, hanging from its head like something you'd see on a carcass. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I turned and ran, my heart slamming in my chest. I didn't look back. The sound of the creature, if that's even what it was muffled, but I could hear something moving behind me. It was close, much too close. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, and I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. I locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night. I don't even know if I slept the next few days. I was too afraid to leave. The figure in the clearing haunted me. I kept hearing things outside, rustling in the trees, but I never saw anything again. Eventually, I packed up and left. I didn't take any chances, and I didn't tell anyone what happened. There was no need to. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had been exhausted, or maybe the isolation had messed with my head. But as I left the woods behind and made my way back to the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up again. I'll never go back to that cabin. Not in a million years. I've always liked the quiet of the park. The mountains, the trees, the distant hum of the wind. They're familiar, almost like an old friend. It's the reason I became a park ranger in the first place. Not the pay, certainly, but the solitude, the stillness. It was supposed to be easy. Get in, do my job, and keep to myself. But the job hasn't been easy lately, not since that night. My name's Ben Hartley. I'm 34. Been working in this park up in the Idaho Panhandle for almost 5 years now. The job's been mostly routine, and I'm good at it. I know the trails, the wildlife, every stream, and bend of the path. But that night, I found something I wasn't prepared for. Something I can't explain. The park's old. It covers a couple hundred square miles of dense forest, steep hills, and rocky outcroppings. We have a small staff, and most of them are based in a bigger ranger station about 40 miles away. Me? I'm stationed at a smaller cabin on the edge of a secluded part of the park. The cabin's nice enough, built in the early 60s. 2 rooms, a wood stove for heat, and a little kitchenette. It sits right by a trail that leads up to a cliff with a view of the valley below. I've spent a lot of nights out there by myself, but that one, it felt different. It was mid-October, and the air had a bite to it, that sharpness that makes you think winter's right around the corner. The trees were turning, the leaves in shades of amber and gold, and the scent of pine filled the air whenever the wind kicked up. It had been a quiet week. Too quiet. We hadn't seen many hikers, and the animals were acting strangely. Not that they ever make sense. One minute the deer are grazing, the next, they're bolting through the underbrush like they're being chased. I was sitting on the porch that evening, a cup of coffee in my hands, staring at the fading sun when I noticed something strange down the trail. It was just a flicker at first, like something moving through the trees too quickly, too low to the ground. I thought it was a deer, maybe, but the shape didn't look right. It wasn't the right size or the way it moved. I squinted, trying to focus, but it was gone as fast as it appeared. I shook it off, probably a trick of the light. I spent the rest of the evening inside, reading over some reports from other rangers. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A thudding sound, like something heavy being dropped on the ground, came from the direction of the trail. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, heading outside to check it out. The cold hit me immediately, but it wasn't the chill that got my attention. It was the stillness. The air had that unnatural quiet to it, like everything was holding its breath. Even the wind had stopped. I walked down the trail, keeping my steps light. The light from the cabin's porch faded behind me, leaving only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The trail was narrow, winding through trees that seemed to stretch forever into the night. As I walked, I noticed more strange things. Broken branches that didn't look like they'd been snapped by an animal. Long scrapes on the bark of trees, like something had been dragging itself along the trunks. Then I saw it. Just off the trail, partially hidden behind a large rock, was a pile of something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. It looked like some kind of debris. But as I got closer, I realized it was something worse. A large, twisted bundle of fur and flesh. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. The fur was matted dark. There was a sickly, almost rotten smell to it. I took a step closer, my heart thudding in my chest. The shape of it didn't make sense. It wasn't an animal, not fully. I could see patches of skin, too, stretched taut over jagged bones. Something about the shape of the legs didn't look right. They were twisted, almost bent backward. The head was the worst part. It was human, or at least part human. The face was twisted into something unnatural, a grotesque blend of animal and something else. Something worse. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But I couldn't. My flashlight shook in my hand, and I backed away, almost tripping over my own feet. I turned and ran back to the cabin, not looking back. The image of that thing burned into my mind. When I reached the safety of the cabin, I locked the door and sat by the stove, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what I had seen. A sick animal? A prank? But it didn't feel like either of those. The rest of the night was uneventful, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things outside. Small noises, like something was moving around in the dark. It wasn't until the early morning that I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I wasn't sure if I was just spooked or if there was something out there in the woods, something I didn't understand. I spent the day trying to distract myself, going over maps, doing routine checks, trying to keep my mind busy. But by the time evening rolled around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to go back down the trail, despite the knot in my stomach. Maybe I'd find something that would explain what I had seen, or at least put my mind at ease. I wasn't expecting what I found. The body, if you could even call it that, was gone. The place where I had seen it the night before was empty, but the ground was disturbed. There were deep, jagged marks in the earth, like something heavy had been dragged through. I crouched down to get a better look, my heart racing again. The marks led off into the forest, deeper than I had ever gone, toward the cliffside. I didn't follow them. I wasn't about to go any further. That night, I packed up my things and called in to headquarters. I told them I had seen something strange, but I didn't want to admit to what I had really found. They didn't question me too much. The morning I left, I didn't tell anyone about the marks or the strange shape I had found, or the dragging marks in the earth. I drove out of the park and didn't look back. And maybe that was cowardly, but I didn't care. I had seen enough. The sun was setting behind the trees as I made my way down the dirt road, the faint orange light filtering through the thick woods. I had taken the same road countless times over the years, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, the way the air felt heavier, or perhaps it was just the knowledge that I was about to spend the night alone in my cousin's cabin, deep in the woods. It had been a while since I'd visited. My cousin Matt had been urging me to come up for months, and I finally decided to take him up on the offer. We hadn't seen each other in years, not since the last time I'd come here, and something about the old place felt nostalgic in a strange, unsettling way. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the woods, but tonight it felt like the kind of quiet that sits just under your skin. The road twisted through the thick trees, and my car bounced over the uneven ground. The further I went, the more isolated everything seemed. There were no houses, no roads leading anywhere else, just miles of woods and that ever-encroaching feeling that something was watching. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes your heart race, but a gnawing sense that you shouldn't be here, even though you know you're not technically doing anything wrong. When I finally reached the cabin, it stood just as I remembered it, old and weathered, tucked away in a small clearing surrounded by trees. The cabin was nothing special, just a simple structure made of rough-hewn logs, but it always had a certain charm. It had been Matt's granddad's cabin before him, passed down through the family like a forgotten relic of a time long gone. The paint on the door was chipped, and the windows were dusty, but it felt familiar, safe. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up to the porch, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. I paused for a moment, surveying the clearing around me. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves. The trees stood still like statues, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets. Stepping inside, I was hit with that musty, wood-scented air that I remembered so well. The interior was dark, only a little light filtering through the windows. I set my things down in the small entryway, then walked into the main room. The fireplace was in the center of the room, a small stack of firewood beside it, ready to be used. The furniture was old but comfortable. A worn leather couch, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a small wooden table in the center. I had come to the cabin to relax, to get away from the noise of the city. I didn't expect anything strange to happen, but as I stood there, looking around, I started to feel it. The way the air seemed thicker in this room, the stillness that made my skin crawl. It was like the cabin was holding its breath. I set up a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames breaking the silence in a welcome way. I made a cup of coffee and sat on the couch, staring into the flickering fire. The warm glow filled the room, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor and up the walls. It wasn't long before night fell, the darkness seeping in through the windows like ink. The sounds of the woods outside began to fade, leaving just the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a log. That's when I heard it. At first, it was a faint noise, something so subtle that I almost thought it was the wind or the house settling. But then it came again, soft, like the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. I stood up slowly, straining my ears to listen. It was odd. Matt wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow, and the idea of someone else being out here was unsettling. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and I hadn't seen another car on the road. I moved quietly to the window and peered out into the night. Nothing, just the stillness of the trees under the moonlight. The porch was empty. Maybe it was an animal, something small like a raccoon or a deer, but the sound had been too distinct, too deliberate. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to the couch, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the window. My mind was racing, filling in the blanks with irrational thoughts. Maybe it was a person, someone who had been watching the cabin for a while, waiting for the perfect moment to sneak in. Maybe it was nothing at all. But then the noise came again, this time louder, more pronounced. There were footsteps on the porch, not just one set, but two. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard a car, and the way the footsteps moved, it wasn't a casual stroll, it was deliberate, purposeful. I grabbed my phone from the table, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. No signal, of course. I hadn't expected there to be one, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. The footsteps grew louder, and now I could hear a scraping sound, like someone running their hand along the side of the cabin. I glanced around the room, looking for something, anything, to defend myself with. The fire poker was too far away, but the thought of facing whoever was out there with nothing but my bare hands made my stomach churn. I crept to the door, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't see anything from where I stood. The porch was shrouded in darkness, and the firelight didn't reach that far. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps had stopped, and all I could hear was the faint rustling of the trees. Maybe it was just an animal after all. And then the door rattled. It was a soft sound, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Someone was out there trying to open the door. The lock clicked in place, but I didn't know how long it would hold if someone was determined to break in. The thought of them out there, standing in the darkness, watching the cabin, made my skin crawl. I tried to push down the panic rising in my chest, tried to think, what should I do? Should I try to make a run for it? But the thought of stepping outside into the night with whoever or whatever was out there was terrifying. I stayed where I was, pressing myself against the wall beside the door, my breathing shallow and quiet. The noise outside stopped as quickly as it had started. For a long time, I stood still, listening to the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this cabin, that someone was waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. The scraping sound faded, and all was still again. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move. The fire was still crackling, but the warmth no longer comforted me. It felt like a small bubble of safety, and I didn't want to leave it. I waited until morning. I didn't sleep a wink that night, my eyes fixed on the door, my ears straining for the smallest sound. The night was endless, the minutes crawling by, each second thick with tension. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the windows, I knew it was time to leave. I couldn't stay another night in the cabin. The sense of being watched had only grown stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. I packed my things quickly, not daring to linger. As I stepped out onto the porch, the world was bathed in the soft light of morning, the birds already singing in the trees. There was no sign of anyone having been there the night before, but I knew what I had heard. I couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it, but I knew it had been real. I left the cabin behind, driving back down the road, not looking back. The forest was quiet again, and I knew that whatever had happened out there in the woods, I had no intention of ever finding out. I wouldn't be coming back. I had always craved solitude, especially after everything that had happened in the past year. The weight of work, the noise of the city, and the constant barrage of responsibilities had begun to suffocate me. So when I found an old cabin in the heart of the French countryside, nestled deep in the forest of the Pyrenees, I knew it was the perfect retreat. It was the middle of autumn, around mid-October, and the forest was alive with the colors of the season. The trees were heavy with the reds and oranges of dying leaves, and a crisp chill hung in the air. I was 29, not young enough to escape the grind of adult life, but still with enough vigor to seek refuge in the wilds. I had rented the cabin from an old couple who had been living in the village near the forest. They seemed kind enough, but there was something off about them, a hesitation in their eyes when they handed me the keys and wished me a safe stay. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through narrow, rocky roads that seemed to be swallowed by the thick canopy of trees. The road signs were old, rusted, almost unreadable in places, and I questioned whether anyone had used this path in years. But I kept pushing forward, eager for the quiet that awaited me. The cabin itself was small, about the size of a two-bedroom house, and made of dark, weathered wood that seemed to blend seamlessly with the forest around it. It looked like something from another era. The roof was steep and covered in moss, and the windows were small, with thick shutters that could be closed to shut out the world. I was struck by how remote it felt, the nearest village a good hour away by car, and the only sounds in the air were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. There was a feeling of history here, like the land had been untouched by time. Inside, the cabin was warm, if a little musty. The furniture was old, but solid, and the wooden floors creaked underfoot, as if they had stories to tell. There was a small stone fireplace in the living room, and I wasted no time in starting a fire, the warmth quickly chasing away the cool autumn air. The kitchen was simple, equipped with the basics: a gas stove, a few pans, and a small refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner. The bedroom had a heavy quilt on the bed, with thick curtains that blocked out the fading light from outside. I immediately felt at home. I spent the first few days in the cabin enjoying the peace I had longed for. I woke early to the sound of birds chirping, went on long hikes through the forest, and spent hours reading by the fire at night. There was something strangely comforting about the isolation. But as the days passed, a sense of unease started to creep in, like something was subtly off, just out of sight, always lingering in the corner of my mind. It began with small things. The wind, for one. It howled through the trees at night, but it sounded different, strangled, almost like it was trying to speak. I convinced myself it was just the forest, the natural sounds of the woods. But there was a certain pattern to the gusts, as though the wind itself was trying to communicate something. One evening, while I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, I noticed a faint movement in the trees. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I saw something or someone moving between the trunks. It was only a fleeting glimpse, and I quickly dismissed it as my eyes playing tricks on me. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an uncomfortable chill run down my spine. The next morning, I set out on a hike deeper into the forest, hoping to shake off the growing sense of unease. The forest was thick with pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, spongy layer. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and the deeper I ventured, the more I felt a connection with the wilderness around me. But as I moved further into the trees, I started to hear something strange, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the underbrush. But when I stopped to listen, it stopped too. I assumed it was some animal, perhaps a deer or a boar, and tried to shake it off. But the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. By the time I returned to the cabin, the feeling of being unsettled had grown. I found my nerves fraying, my mind replaying the strange noises and the movement I had seen in the trees. It was hard to pinpoint why I felt this way. Nothing had happened, nothing out of the ordinary. But the cabin, the forest, the isolation, all of it seemed to be slowly wearing on me. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it again, the rustling in the trees. This time it was closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was definitely the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching over the dry leaves and twigs. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest, but the noise stopped immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. It was like the entire forest had gone still, as though it was holding its breath. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew one thing for certain: I was not alone. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the rustling in the trees anymore. I started to hear faint knocks on the cabin's walls, like someone was tapping on the wood from the outside. I checked the windows, but there was nothing. The knocks would come in rhythmic intervals, always at night, always when the fire was low, and it was as if something was trying to get my attention. One morning, I woke up to find the door to the cabin slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. The wind had been calm when I went to bed, and there was no logical explanation for how it could have opened. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. The strange thing was, nothing had been disturbed. There were no footprints outside, no signs of anyone having been around. It was as though the door had opened on its own. I decided to investigate the area around the cabin. I checked the perimeter, looking for anything unusual. That's when I found the footprints. They were small, too small to be mine, and they led into the woods. I followed them, my mind racing with all the possibilities. Maybe it was just someone from the village, a hunter or a hiker, but the closer I got to the edge of the forest, the more it felt like the woods themselves were pulling me in. The tracks led to a clearing I had never seen before, a place that felt wrong. The trees here were twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent, as if something had warped them. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, half covered in moss and dirt. It looked ancient, out of place, like it had been here for centuries. As I stepped closer, I felt the air grow colder, a chill settling in my bones. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me, moving toward the clearing. I turned, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the stone, and the oppressive silence. I couldn't explain it. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, to head back to the cabin and lock myself inside. But something compelled me to stay, to see this through, to understand what was happening. The urge was overwhelming. And then, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I saw it. A figure, just a silhouette at first, emerged from the shadow of the forest. It was tall, thin, and seemed to blend with the trees, as though it were made of the same gnarled bark. I couldn't make out any features, only the shape, the movement, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen, unable to move. Finally, I forced myself to turn away and run back to the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with confusion and fear. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. That night, I packed my things and left. I drove back down the narrow, twisting roads without looking back. By the time I reached the village, the sun had set, and the streets were empty, quiet. The old couple who had rented me the cabin were gone, their house dark and still. I never saw them again. I never spoke of what happened in that cabin, not to anyone. It was too strange, too unsettling, and I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that I had been alone, but I wasn't. Something had been watching me in that forest, something that had been waiting for me to leave. And as I drove away, the trees behind me stood tall and silent, like they knew something I didn't. I didn't go back to that forest. I don't think I ever will. I'd been craving some time alone, a chance to disconnect from everything. It had been a tough year. Work was draining, relationships were strained, and the constant noise of the city felt suffocating. So, I found an old cabin online, in a secluded spot out in the woods. No phone service, no neighbors for miles, just me, the trees, and whatever silence I could get. I was 32, a little too old to be running off to a cabin for a solo retreat, but I didn't care. I rented a Jeep, threw some gear in the back, and drove for hours, heading deeper into a stretch of forest that felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. I remember the drive being long and winding, with the trees growing thicker as I went, the roads narrowing, until there was just enough space for my car to squeeze through. The sun was setting by the time I got close, painting the sky with a mix of purple and orange. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. Old, rustic, but solid enough. It had a wraparound porch and a sloping roof that seemed to sag under the weight of years of snow and rain. There were no neighbors nearby, no signs of life, just trees and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I stepped out of the Jeep and stretched, feeling the cold air hit my face. I was in the middle of nowhere, but it was peaceful. For the first time in months, I could feel my shoulders drop, the tension easing. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and made my way up the creaky steps to the front door. The wood was weathered but held together. The door opened with a loud groan, revealing a small, dimly lit living room. There was a fireplace at the far wall and a few mismatched chairs around a wooden table. I could already tell that this place hadn't seen many guests over the years. Dust lay thick over everything, and the air smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. The windows were grimy, and a heavy smell of pine sap mixed with the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners. But it was fine. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a roof over my head and the quiet to clear my mind. I spent the next few hours unpacking, sweeping out some of the dust, and setting up a fire. By the time the sun had fully set, I was sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, the warm glow of the fire lighting up the room. Felt like I could finally breathe. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked under its pressure, but the cabin was sturdy, and I felt safe. The silence of the woods was the only sound that kept me company as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just beginning to filter through the cracks in the curtains. I got up, stretched, and stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air. The landscape was breathtaking. The snow had started to fall again, light flakes drifting down from the sky, blanketing the ground in white. The trees were still, their branches heavy with snow. I spent the next few days hiking around the area, enjoying the solitude. The woods were peaceful, but there was something strange about the silence here. It was too perfect. Not a single bird, no animals rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't that there was no life in the woods. It just felt like something was holding its breath, waiting. By the third day, I began to feel it, that nagging sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It wasn't much at first, just a quiet feeling that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I'd hear the occasional snap of a twig behind me when I was walking, or a low rustle in the trees, but when I turned around, there was nothing, just the quiet, just the wind. One afternoon, I decided to head out on a longer hike, heading deeper into the woods, further away from the cabin. The trail wasn't marked, but I figured I could follow my tracks back if I got lost. I had been hiking for a couple of hours when I stumbled across something odd, a pile of broken branches and dried leaves in a small clearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I moved closer, I noticed that the branches weren't scattered naturally. They were arranged in a circle. It wasn't huge, but it was too neat to be random. I stared at it for a few moments, trying to make sense of it. There was no way someone had been out here recently. The ground was undisturbed, the air still. The whole area felt untouched, except for this strange little arrangement. I stepped into the circle, and as soon as I did, I felt it. A sudden shift in the air around me. Coldness, a tightness in my chest. I turned around, looking over my shoulder like I was being watched, but nothing was there. Just the woods, quiet and unfeeling. I didn't linger any longer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned and headed back toward the cabin, the uneasy feeling settling deeper into my bones. When I got back, I found that the door to the cabin was wide open. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of it. I hadn't even touched it when I'd left. My stomach churned. It was silly, but I felt like something had been inside. Something had been there, just waiting. I checked the place just to make sure. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing was missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The rest of the evening was a blur, my mind racing, jumping at every little noise. The crack of wood, the whistle of wind through the trees, the creak of the cabin settling. I decided I'd leave the next morning. This whole thing had started to feel off. The silence, the strange feeling in the woods, the open door. It wasn't worth it. That night, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees like a living thing. Couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Footsteps, breathing, always just out of reach, always too quiet to be certain. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to ignore it, but the unease kept building, pressing down on me until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside onto the porch, desperate for a breath of fresh air. The snow was falling harder now, and the trees around the cabin groaned under its weight. The world seemed so still, but I could feel it, the weight of the forest, the weight of something waiting. That's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the tree line. A shadow too tall to be an animal, too still to be a person. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me, studying me from the dark. I froze, my heart racing. My breath came in short, quick gasps, and I had to force myself to look away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I backed into the cabin, my mind spinning, my hands trembling. I locked the door behind me and sat in the dark, listening to the wind, my pulse hammering in my ears. The rest of the night passed slowly, each minute stretching on longer than the last. I didn't dare look out the window again. I didn't sleep. I just waited, and when morning finally came, I packed my things and left, not looking back. As I drove away, I felt the weight lift. The unease, the feeling of being watched, it all started to fade. But one thing stuck with me. I remembered the circle of branches in the woods, the way it had felt unnatural, like a warning. I never went back to that cabin. It was mid-October, and the cold wind had already begun to creep into the bones of the forest. I had been planning this trip for months. A few days alone in the mountains, far away from the noise of the world. A chance to reset, to get my head straight after months of working a job that seemed to be swallowing me whole. The cabin I'd rented was tucked deep into the woods, nestled near an old cemetery, abandoned long before anyone cared to keep it up. I wasn't worried about it. I liked the solitude, the quiet. There was something comforting about being completely alone with only the sound of the wind and the rustling of leaves for company. So, I packed my bags, grabbed the rifle, just in case, and set out in my old 4x4, following the narrow dirt road that wound its way through the mountains. The weather was grim that day, the sky heavy with dark clouds that threatened rain, though none had yet fallen. The trees were skeletal, their branches stripped of leaves, leaving them naked and brittle-looking, stretching out as if to touch the road. The path was bumpy, uneven, and each jolt of the truck made me feel a little more distant from civilization. Eventually, after what felt like hours of bouncing along the dirt trail, I finally spotted it, the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood that had been worn by the elements. The roof sagged in places, the windows were covered with grime, and the porch had a few boards missing. But it was perfect, just the kind of place I wanted. Isolated, quiet, and old. I parked the truck in front, the engine's hum dying as I stepped out. The silence was overwhelming, like the world had been turned off. I could hear the leaves crunching under my boots, the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the wind, but other than that, it was dead quiet. I unloaded my things into the cabin, unpacking my gear and setting up camp inside. The cabin had just enough space for a small wood stove in the corner, a few chairs, and a table that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The air inside was damp, cold, and stale, but the firewood stacked beside the stove promised warmth. I got the fire going, the flickering flames casting long shadows against the walls. By the time evening rolled around, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, turning the sky a dark purple. The wind had picked up too, howling through the trees outside. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and the cabin, though cold, felt like a safe refuge from the growing storm. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside to take a quick walk around. The cemetery was just up the hill from the cabin. I hadn't paid it much attention when I first arrived, but now that I was here, I thought I'd at least take a look. The old wrought iron gate was rusted, barely hanging on its hinges. The gravestones, most of which were half fallen, had long been swallowed by weeds. Some of the stones were so worn that the names were illegible, their markings eaten away by time. I walked past the first row of graves, feeling the cold bite of the wind cut through my jacket. I didn't feel afraid, not yet. I'd been in remote places before, places that were much more desolate than this. I wasn't superstitious, but something about this place. Maybe it was the way the wind whistled through the trees, or the way the graves seemed to watch me, left a strange unease in my chest. I stood for a moment, just looking at the graves, before deciding to head back to the cabin. The temperature was dropping quickly now, and the wind had become a steady, biting chill. I didn't want to get caught outside after dark. As I turned to leave, I heard something, a faint sound, almost like footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. My hand instinctively went to my rifle, but I paused, trying to shake off the feeling. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I hurried back down the hill, the crunching of the leaves growing louder behind me. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there. Back inside the cabin, I locked the door behind me and stoked the fire. The wind outside was howling now, the trees creaking like they were about to snap. The shadows in the cabin seemed deeper than before, stretching unnaturally across the walls. I tried to shrug off the creeping feeling of unease, but the silence in the cabin felt heavier now. I decided to eat something, grabbing a can of beans from my bag and heating them up on the stove. I couldn't help but glance toward the window, the darkness outside pressing against the glass. The storm had started to rain, the drops hitting the roof like a drumbeat. As I sat there, eating my dinner and listening to the storm, I heard something again, a faint scratching sound coming from the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The scratching continued, faint but persistent. It was too rhythmic to be an animal. I stood up slowly, my hand reaching for the rifle by the door. The storm outside raged louder, masking any other sound. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low thud, as though something heavy had dropped onto the porch. I slowly approached the door, heart pounding in my chest. I opened the door just a crack, rifle raised. There was nothing there, only the dark, rainy night. I stepped outside cautiously, the rain soaking through my jacket almost immediately. The porch was empty, save for a few fallen branches and leaves that had blown in. But then, I noticed something. A single, fresh set of footprints in the mud. They were large, heavy prints like someone had been standing there for a while. But there was no one in sight. My mind raced. Had someone been watching me? Had I missed them earlier when I was walking back from the cemetery? I backed into the cabin, closing the door with a heavy thud. My pulse was racing now, my mind replaying every noise, every movement. It felt as though something was waiting just outside, just beyond the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The night dragged on in a strange, unsettling quiet. The fire was low, and the storm outside didn't let up. I tried to distract myself, reading a book, but every creak of the cabin made me jump. It was almost as if the place was alive, groaning and shifting as the storm battered it from all sides. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside again. This time it was different. A loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the porch. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was pulling something heavy. I grabbed the rifle and made my way to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, but the dragging sound continued. I turned the lights off, trying to minimize any glow that might make me visible from the outside. I felt my heart in my throat, my breath shallow as I stood in the dark, waiting. My eyes darted between the window and the door, straining to see any movement. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the yard, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, too tall, and its movements were unnaturally slow. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape, swaying slightly in the wind. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I gripped the rifle so tightly my hands began to shake. It moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the cabin. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, disappeared into the trees as if it was never there at all. The dragging sound stopped. The silence returned. I stayed there for what felt like hours, just waiting for any sound. Anything that would tell me what was happening. But it was nothing. No more dragging. No more figures. By morning, the storm had passed, the sky clear and blue. The forest was eerily quiet, as if the night's events had never happened. I stepped outside, rifle slung over my shoulder, and examined the porch. There was nothing. No signs of anyone being there. No more footprints, no more dragging sounds. I packed up my things and left without a second thought. The cabin, though old and remote, was no longer a place of solace. It was a place of waiting, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what had been watching me in the dark. As I drove away, the weight of the experience lifted from my chest, replaced by a strange relief. The cemetery was now just a distant memory in my rearview mirror, a place forgotten by time but not by something else. The silence of the forest had been deafening, but the quiet that followed was a relief. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to take a break from everything and head out into the woods for a weekend alone. I'd been under a lot of pressure at work, and I figured a couple of days in solitude would be the perfect reset. So, I rented a small, secluded cabin about 30 miles outside of the nearest town. The place was old but seemed sturdy enough, located near the edge of a thick forest in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. There were no neighbors for miles, just trees and rugged terrain. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that made your breath visible in the fading light. I unloaded my gear, grabbed a flashlight, and checked the cabin's surroundings before heading inside. The place had that musty smell, the scent of wood and dust. The walls creaked a little as I moved through the rooms, but it was cozy. It was clear no one had lived there for a while, but it seemed well kept. I wasn't worried about being alone. The cabin was just far enough from civilization that I felt a sense of peace, but also just isolated enough to feel the weight of being completely cut off. Still, I wasn't particularly scared. I wasn't a rookie in the outdoors. I'd spent plenty of nights camping and hiking in remote areas, and I knew how to handle myself. Besides, I wasn't out here to look for trouble. I just wanted to relax. After settling in, I started a fire in the stove and unpacked my things. It wasn't long before the sun disappeared entirely, and the darkness outside grew absolute, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. The only light came from the fire and a few lanterns I set up inside. There was a chill to the air now, but nothing too unbearable. I spent the next couple of hours cooking dinner, reading a book, and just listening to the quiet of the night. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint sound, like a twig snapping. I froze, my hands still on the book I was holding. I stood up, listening. Nothing, just the wind rustling the leaves outside. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably an animal or just the wind playing tricks. I went to bed soon after, my mind still running through thoughts about work and life. As I lay in bed, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside. It was loud enough to drown out most other noises. I eventually fell asleep, but something stirred me in the middle of the night. A noise, a scraping sound. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. A scraping against wood. I lay still, listening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was coming from outside. It sounded like something, or someone, was scraping their hands against the walls of the cabin. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a raccoon or something. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The sound stopped as soon as I moved, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and went to the door. I swung it open cautiously, flashlight in hand. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating only the immediate area around the cabin. There was nothing, just the trees and the dark, winding path leading off into the woods. I stepped outside, listening. The wind had died down, but the feeling in the air had changed. There was something off about it, something tense, like the world was holding its breath. The only thing I could hear now was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, walking around with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything unusual. No footprints, no signs of anything trying to get in. Just the quiet wilderness surrounding me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was heavy with a strange energy, like it was thick with anticipation. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, but the unease stayed with me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had been near the cabin. Maybe I'd imagined the noise. But as I tried to sleep again, I kept hearing that scraping sound, now distant, but persistent. It was almost rhythmic, like something was walking around the cabin, dragging its fingers along the walls. My nerves were shot. Couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every little noise setting my mind racing. The sounds of the night became sharper and clearer in the silence, every crack in the walls and creak of the floorboards amplifying my anxiety. When the first light of morning finally broke, I was exhausted. I didn't know what had kept me up all night, but I had the nagging feeling that it wasn't something normal. I decided to leave for the day, get away from the cabin, maybe find a nearby hiking trail to take my mind off things. I packed a small bag with food and water and made sure my rifle was loaded before heading out. As I walked down the path leading away from the cabin, I noticed more signs of disturbance. Broken branches, trampled leaves, nothing too obvious, but it was clear that something had been moving around in the area. I made my way through the woods for a few hours, not really heading anywhere specific. My nerves had settled a bit, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I kept scanning the trees around me, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone or something was close by. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something in the distance, a shape moving between the trees. It was hard to make out at first, but as it came closer, I could tell it was a person. A man, dressed in ragged clothes, stumbling along the path. His hair was long and tangled, his face obscured by a thick beard. He moved strangely, dragging his feet, like he was barely able to stand. I froze, unsure of what to do. This was the middle of nowhere. Who the hell was this guy? And why was he so far out here alone? I stepped back, trying to get out of sight, but the man didn't seem to notice me. He walked on, his eyes never leaving the ground in front of him. Something about his movements, his unnatural gait, the way his arms hung limp at his sides, set off alarm bells in my head. I waited for a few more minutes, watching him move further down the path before deciding to head back to the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up again. It felt like something was closing in on me, and I didn't want to take any chances. When I returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip again, but this time I didn't feel like staying. I packed up my things, locked up, and made the decision to drive back to town. I didn't care if I lost the money on the rental or if I didn't get the peace I was looking for. The feeling in the air was too much. Just as I was about to get in the truck, I heard a sound behind me. A twig snapping, soft but deliberate. I spun around, my heart pounding. There, standing just beyond the trees, was the man I'd seen earlier. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, everything went still. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. His teeth were jagged and sharp, his grin far too wide for a human face. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel. The road was empty, the night dark and quiet, but I couldn't shake the image of that man's face from my mind. I couldn't explain what I saw, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. There was something in those woods, something that wasn't human, and it was waiting. I didn't stay in the area long enough to find out what else was out there. I don't know what happened to that man, or if I'll ever know the truth about what I saw that night. But I do know one thing. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some things in the woods are better left alone. It was the last time I ever set foot in those woods. The rain came down in sheets that night. I had been planning on a quiet weekend getaway, just some time to myself, away from the noise and hassle of everyday life. It was supposed to be peaceful, just a little cabin in the woods near Bear Creek, about 2 hours outside of town. No phone signal, no distractions, just me, nature, and some much-needed solitude. I had rented the cabin from a guy named Gary who claimed his family had owned it for decades. The cabin wasn't much to look at, rustic, worn down, and small, but it had a certain charm, especially with the smell of wood and earth. It was tucked into a little valley, surrounded by thick trees that looked like they'd been standing there forever. The kind of trees that make you feel small, like you're nothing more than a brief passing in the history of the world. When I arrived, the sky had been cloudy, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves. I was already soaked by the time I unloaded my car, but the promise of warmth and quiet had kept me going. Gary had shown me around briefly, pointing out the essentials, including the wood stove for heat and the small propane lanterns that were supposed to light the cabin at night. He left me with a spare key and told me to make myself at home. As he drove away, The last thing he said was, "The weather's turning, so stay safe. It can get pretty wild out here in the winter." I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, as I stood in the small living room of the cabin, staring out the fogged window, I knew he hadn't been exaggerating. The rain had started to fall harder, the wind picking up. I could see the trees swaying, their limbs creaking as if protesting the storm's fury. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture and tension. Inside, the cabin was warm enough, but a chill lingered in the corners. It was one of those old places that had been built to keep the cold out, but not always keep the warmth in. The fire crackled quietly in the stove, throwing soft shadows across the room. I tried to shake off the unease that had started creeping in, settling like a knot in my stomach. It was just a storm, nothing to worry about. I set down my things, unpacking the bare essentials, a few changes of clothes, some books, my hiking gear, and the food I had brought with me. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I moved around, and the sound of the rain against the roof grew louder, drowning out everything else. I was trying to relax, get into the right mindset for the weekend, but something didn't feel right. I could hear the wind howling outside, pushing against the walls of the cabin, but that wasn't it. It was the quiet, the kind of quiet that felt too thick, too all-encompassing. It was like the world outside had been swallowed up by the storm, and all that was left was me and this little cabin, stranded in the middle of nowhere. The night stretched on. I had lit one of the lanterns and placed it on the table by the window, its soft, flickering light barely cutting through the dark. I ate a quick meal, nothing fancy, and tried to read for a while. The wind outside kept picking up, howling through the trees like some kind of animal in distress. It was hard to concentrate with that sound filling the silence. By the time I decided to turn in, the storm had intensified. The rain now pounded relentlessly against the roof, and the wind was so strong that I could hear the trees scraping against each other. It was a noise that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was alive and angry. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. I had always been sensitive to the weather, especially storms. The energy that a bad storm brought, almost like it was too powerful to be contained, always left me feeling uneasy. The bed was old, but the sheets smelled fresh, and I tried to settle into a comfortable position. The house creaked and groaned around me, the wood settling under the strain of the wind. I tried to ignore the noises outside, but there was one that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something that sounded closer. I sat up, straining to listen. At first, it was faint, a tap-tap-tapping. It could have been a branch hitting the cabin's walls, or maybe it was just the wind shaking the loose shingles on the roof. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and it didn't match the usual noises the storm was making. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I rolled over, pulling the covers up to my chin, and shut my eyes. But the tapping continued, more insistent now, louder, like something or someone was trying to get in. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, and it was close. I got out of bed slowly, moving as quietly as possible, trying to avoid making any sound that might give away my presence. I grabbed the lantern from the nightstand and made my way to the front door, trying not to let my mind wander to darker thoughts. The wind outside howled, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of wet earth and pine. I stepped outside, holding the lantern high, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately, but I didn't care. The tapping sound was louder now, coming from behind the cabin. I moved toward the back of the cabin, my boots sinking into the wet ground with every step. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp, repetitive knocking. But it wasn't coming from the wood of the cabin. It was coming from below. I knelt down, squinting through the dark, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Then I saw it. A figure, someone, standing by the old stone foundation of the cabin. It was hard to make out at first, just a shadow in the dark. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see that it was a man. He was wearing a rain-soaked jacket, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the ground. I froze, the lantern shaking in my hand. I tried to call out, but no sound came. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined him. But then he shifted, and I saw that he was kneeling next to something. A large rock that had been disturbed moved aside. Beneath it, there was something dark and wet. I should have turned around and gone back inside. But something in me, something primal, held me in place. The man stood up slowly, turning to face me. His expression was hidden, but his posture was unmistakable. He knew I had seen him. His hands were shaking as he reached down to adjust his coat, and then he simply turned and walked into the woods. I stood there, stunned, the lantern still shaking in my hand. The rain had started to let up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. I waited, not sure what to do. Minutes passed, and the silence grew even more profound. Eventually, I stepped forward, my instincts telling me to investigate, to find out what had happened. But when I got to the spot where the man had been, the ground was undisturbed. There was no sign of him, no trail leading into the woods, just the lingering smell of rain and pine. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I didn't sleep well, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a still, gray sky. The air was thick with humidity, but the oppressive feeling from the night before had lifted. I spent the rest of the weekend hiking through the woods, trying to put the strange encounter behind me. I never did figure out what had really happened that night. Maybe it was just a traveler looking for shelter in the storm, or maybe it was something else. Something I didn't want to think about too hard. But when I left the cabin, there was something in the back of my mind, a nagging thought that stayed with me long after I'd driven away. Something wasn't right about that place, about that night. The man, the tapping, the way he vanished without a trace. It all felt wrong, like I had stumbled into something I wasn't meant to see. As I drove back towards civilization, the rain finally stopped, the sky clearing up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened out there in the woods, I was better off not knowing. I never went back to that cabin again. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. I had been planning it for months. A break from the grind of everyday life. A cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from the bustling city. Just me, the quiet, and nature. The kind of place where I could unwind, maybe do some reading, maybe fish a bit if the mood struck me. I was 34 years old and had always enjoyed being outdoors. But this trip would turn out to be far from what I expected. In the end, it wasn't the peace and solitude that greeted me. Instead, I stumbled into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was late autumn when I arrived, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. The drive had been long, winding through dirt roads that seemed to get narrower and darker the further I went. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time I reached the cabin, casting everything in a dusky blue. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, sitting by a small, clear lake. There were a few trees scattered around, and the quiet was nearly suffocating. A cold wind rustled the leaves, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig underfoot as I unpacked. Inside, the cabin was rustic but cozy. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner with a few chairs around a low coffee table. There was a small kitchen area with a refrigerator, microwave, and a sink. Everything looked well-maintained, but there was something about the place that felt off, like it hadn't been lived in for a while, but someone had just been there recently. I shook off the unease and settled in, lighting a fire in the stove. The warmth spread quickly, filling the room. I'd brought a few books, and I had planned to spend my time reading, fishing, maybe cooking a few meals over the open flame. But as night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too heavy, too deliberate. It came again, slower this time, like someone was walking around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. Nothing. The forest was dark, almost unnervingly so, and there was no sign of movement. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I told myself that it was just the wind, or maybe an animal prowling around. I shut the curtain, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then, just as I turned back toward the fire, I heard the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. 3 slow taps on the front door. My heart skipped. Who could be out here? I hadn't seen another car on the road since I left the main highway hours ago. I moved cautiously toward the door, my hand hovering just above the handle. I didn't know what to expect. My mind raced through possibilities. Someone lost, maybe needing help. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I hesitated, not sure what to do. I thought about calling the local sheriff, but then realized I had no service. The phone sat useless in my pocket. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see the porch, but not enough to invite whoever was out there in. But when I looked, no one was there. The porch was empty, the dim light from inside casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the wood. I felt a chill race up my spine. Then I noticed something odd. A small, crudely carved symbol had been scratched into the wood of the doorframe. It was nothing I recognized, just a series of jagged lines that looked almost like scratches made by a knife. I stepped back, unsure what to make of it. I closed the door quickly, locking it and pushing the heavy wooden bar across. I retreated to the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled and popped in the stove, but the warmth did little to ease the growing unease settling in my bones. I glanced around the room, as though expecting someone to appear from the shadows. My mind kept returning to the symbol, to the steps I'd heard earlier. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't explain what. Hours passed. The night stretched on, and I eventually fell into a fitful sleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the fire burning low in the stove. My dreams were filled with distorted images, figures in the woods, shadows creeping across the floor. Every time I woke up, I felt more certain that someone was out there, watching me. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The sunlight filtering through the windows seemed almost too bright, too harsh. I decided to go outside to clear my head. Maybe some fresh air would help me shake off the unease. I stepped out onto the porch, the morning air biting at my skin. The forest was still, almost unnervingly so. There were no birds, no rustling of animals. It felt as though everything was holding its breath. I looked at the symbol on the doorframe again, but this time, I noticed something else. The scratches weren't just on the door. They were on the surrounding wood, as though someone had been carving into it for a while. I moved cautiously down the steps and toward the lake. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the bare trees around it. But as I walked closer, I noticed something in the distance. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods, just outside my line of sight. I couldn't make out any details, but I was certain someone was there, watching me. I turned and rushed back to the cabin, my heart racing. I locked the door behind me, my mind reeling. There was no way I was imagining this. Someone was out there, and they were deliberately watching me. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to the city, but the road back was long, and I wasn't sure if I'd be safe even if I did leave. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, much closer. They weren't just circling the cabin, they were coming toward the door. My pulse quickened. I stood, gripping a heavy log from the fire, ready to defend myself. A knock came, sharp and insistent. I didn't answer. There was silence for a moment, then another knock, and another. The sound was so loud now, it felt like it was coming from inside the cabin itself. Then I heard it. A voice, muffled and distant, as though coming from far away, but still clear enough for me to hear. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, panic gripping me. I didn't know who it was, but I knew I couldn't trust them. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial 911, but there was still no signal. Suddenly, the door shook violently. Someone was trying to break in. I sprinted toward the window and peeked outside, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could just make out a figure standing near the door, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. But there was no way to see their face. I knew I had to act fast. I rushed to the back of the cabin, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. I found a crowbar tucked under the porch steps, its metal surface cold against my hands. I stood in the shadows, waiting, heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and I heard the figure step inside. For a split second, there was complete silence. Then I saw him, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the firelight. He was wearing a ski mask, and his eyes were cold, calculating. Without thinking, I lunged forward, swinging the crowbar with all my strength. I hit him square in the chest, and he staggered back, falling to the floor with a heavy thud. I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I turned and ran, bursting out the back door and into the woods. I ran without looking back, my mind consumed by the fear of what might be lurking behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the road, where a passing car finally saw me and stopped. The driver, a man in his mid-40s, helped me into his car and drove me to the nearest town. The sheriff arrived at the cabin the next morning. They found the door open, the fire still smoldering in the stove, but there was no sign of the man. The only thing left behind was a bloody handprint on the doorframe. They never found out who he was. The sheriff said the cabin had been abandoned for years, and no one knew of any neighbors nearby. They offered me a ride back to the city, but I declined, opting to stay with friends instead. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget what happened there. And every time I hear footsteps in the distance, I wonder if the man is still out there, watching, waiting. I've learned one thing from this experience. Not everything is what it seems, and sometimes the most peaceful places can be the most dangerous. I shouldn't have come out here alone. That much was clear by now. The storm had been raging for hours, and I was stuck in this old cabin, deep in the woods, with nothing but the sound of rain pounding against the roof and the howling wind outside. It was the kind of night that made you feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, thinking I needed a break from the city. Too much noise, too many people, too much stress. A secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere had seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. The listing had described it as cozy and rustic, but in reality, it was barely more than a shack with creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, and an old wood stove that barely worked. Still, I had convinced myself it would be an adventure, something different. The first night had been uneventful. I had brought some books, a bottle of whiskey, and enough food to last the weekend. I built a fire, listened to the rain, and let the silence settle in. It was peaceful in a way, but by the second night, the peacefulness had turned into something else, something uneasy. The storm had gotten worse. The rain came down in thick sheets, and the wind screamed through the trees like something alive. I could hear branches snapping outside, and every now and then, something would thump against the cabin walls. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. I had lost power earlier in the evening. The lights flickered a few times, and then everything went dark. I had brought candles, so it wasn't a big deal at first, but as the hours dragged on, the darkness started to feel heavier. The cabin felt smaller, more suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on me. I sat on the old couch in the main room, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the weak glow of the candles. The fire had gone out an hour ago, and I hadn't bothered to relight it. The wood was damp, and I didn't feel like struggling with it. Then I heard it, a noise outside, barely audible over the storm, a crunch, like someone stepping on wet leaves. My stomach tightened. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Nothing to be scared of. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath. The logical part of my brain told me there was no way anyone else was out here in this weather. The nearest town was miles away, and the road leading to the cabin was practically a mud pit. No one would be wandering around in the middle of a storm like this. But the sound didn't stop. I reached for the flashlight I had left on the table and flicked it on. The weak beam barely reached the window. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin had a small front porch, and I could just make out the shape of something standing at the edge of the light. A figure, not an animal, person. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. Watching, I took a step back, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here? A lost hiker? Someone looking for shelter? But they weren't knocking. They weren't calling out. Just standing there, in the rain, watching me. I grabbed the fireplace poker, the closest thing to a weapon I had, and edged toward the door. My hand hovered over the lock. If this person needed help, I couldn't just leave them out there. But something about the way they were just standing there, silent, unmoving, sent a deep primal fear through me. I tightened my grip on the poker and called out, my voice hoarse. Hello? No answer. The wind howled, rattling the windows. Rain lashed against the glass. And then, in a blink, the figure was gone. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling. I hadn't looked away. I had been staring right at them. And yet, somehow, they had disappeared. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. Maybe I had imagined it. But I didn't believe that. I locked the door, checked the windows, pushed a chair up against the door, just in case. My hands were shaking. For the next hour, I sat in silence, listening. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I told myself I was overreacting, that there was nothing out there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just when I started to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard something else. Not outside this time, inside. A soft, deliberate creak from the back of the cabin. My mouth went dry. I hadn't checked the back door. Had I locked it? Couldn't remember. My mind was a blur of fear and doubt. I stood up slowly, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. I moved toward the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air felt thick, like the whole cabin was holding its breath. I reached the back door. It was closed. I touched the handle, my heart in my throat. It was locked. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding through me. Maybe I really had imagined it. Maybe. A loud crash from the main room. I spun around, my chest tightening. The candlelight flickered wildly. The chair I had wedged against the front door had been knocked over. The door was still locked, but something had been in here. I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in here, not with whatever this was. I grabbed my coat, my keys, my flashlight. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I didn't care if I had to walk miles through the rain and mud. I just needed to leave. Now, I took one last look at the cabin before stepping outside. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, but I didn't stop. I ran, down the path, through the trees, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with rain and sweat. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. As I drove away, my headlights cut through the storm, illuminating the cabin one last time. And for just a second, I saw it. A figure standing in the window, watching me leave. I had never been the type to believe in stories about things lurking in the woods. The kind of stories that got passed around campfires late at night, meant to scare kids or keep people from wandering too far after dark. I had spent most of my life outdoors, hunting, hiking, working odd jobs in isolated areas. The woods were as familiar to me as the back of my hand. I had never seen anything I couldn't explain, until that winter in Montana. I had taken a job helping a friend of a friend watch over a remote hunting cabin. The owner, an older man named Ray, had left for the season but needed someone to keep an eye on the place. It wasn't much, just a 2-room log cabin deep in the Lolo National Forest. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, and the only way in or out was a long dirt road that cut through dense, snow-covered pines. It was supposed to be an easy job. Just check in, make sure no squatters or animals had wrecked the place, keep the wood stove going, and radio in once a week. The first few days were uneventful. The cabin was old but sturdy. The wind howled through the trees at night, and the snow piled up against the porch, but nothing felt off. I spent my time chopping wood, reading by lantern light, and making simple meals on the old cast iron stove. The silence out there was something I had always enjoyed, but by the third night, I started to notice small things. A few items inside the cabin weren't where I had left them. A chair slightly pulled out from the table. My boots, which I had placed by the door, shifted a few inches to the side. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I had moved them without thinking. Then I found the tracks. I had gone outside just after dawn to collect more firewood when I saw them in the snow. They led from the tree line to the cabin and then back again. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but they were too large, too strange. The front of each print looked almost human, but the back had deep claw marks dragging through the snow. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees were thick, the snow muffled every sound, and no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything out of place. That night, I locked the cabin door and secured the wooden shutters over the windows. I told myself it was just a precaution. There were bears, wolves, any number of animals that could leave strange tracks. But I had never seen tracks like that before. The noises started after dark. At first, it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the cabin, pausing every so often. I stayed still, my heart hammering in my chest. Then something scraped against the wooden walls. Not claws, something sharper. I had my rifle beside me, but I didn't move. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, circling again and again. Then they stopped right outside the front door. The handle rattled. I gripped the rifle tight, staring at the door. The latch held. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I waited, barely breathing. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the tracks were gone. The snow had covered them, but I could still see faint disturbances where something had moved through the drifts. I knew I should leave, but my truck was parked nearly a mile away down the old access road. If something was out there, I would have to go through the forest to reach it. I spent the next day on edge. Every sound made my skin crawl. When night came, I kept the fire low and sat in the dark, listening. Came back. The footsteps. The slow, deliberate circling. This time I saw it. Through a small gap in the wooden shutters, I caught a glimpse of something standing just at the edge of the treeline. Tall, too tall, its limbs long and thin. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't move like a person either. It stood there for what felt like hours before slipping back into the woods. I knew then I had to leave. At first light, I packed my bag, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and made for the truck. The snow was deep, and I had to move slow, keeping my head on a swivel. The forest was silent, too silent. Not even the usual sounds of birds or distant animals. Then I saw the tracks again, fresh, leading from the trees and following the exact path I was taking. I picked up my pace. The truck was just ahead. A branch snapped behind me. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I sprinted the last stretch, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. The engine groaned in protest before roaring to life. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the snow-covered road. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. Something standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I hit the highway, then kept going until I reached the nearest town. I found a payphone and called Ray, telling him I was done. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, I heard that Ray had sent another guy to watch the place. A younger guy, someone who didn't believe in stories either. They never found him, just his truck, parked in the same spot where I had left mine. The door wide open, keys still in the ignition. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I was 34 when I took a job that sent me out to the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a simple project. A few weeks of work on an old cabin deep in the valley, fixing it up for an old man named Raymond Carter. He had bought the place years ago but hadn't been able to maintain it. The structure was still solid, but the roof needed repairs, the wood had started to rot in places, and there was no insulation. It wasn't an impossible job, but it was lonely work. The nearest town was an hour away, and the nearest house was miles down the valley road. Raymond was paying me well, and I needed the money. I had done construction work for years, but things had been slow lately, and I couldn't afford to be picky. He provided supplies, gave me the keys, and told me to take my time. Said he'd check in when he could, but he was getting too old to make the drive often. The first few days were fine. The weather was holding up, and I made good progress. The place was basic: one main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, a small bedroom in the back, and an attic that was more of a storage space. No electricity, no plumbing, just an outhouse in the back and a creek running nearby. It was quiet, peaceful even. That changed on the fourth night. I had finished working for the day and was sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down. It got dark fast in the valley. The trees stretched high, blocking most of the sky, and once the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, the shadows took over. I was used to being alone in the woods. I had camped, hunted, and done remote work plenty of times. But something felt different here. I couldn't explain it, but there was this feeling, like I wasn't alone, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I was tired, and it was easy to get jumpy when you were alone in the woods. But then I heard something, a sound I knew well, footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, careful, not an animal, too heavy. I stood up, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness creeping in. The footsteps stopped the moment I moved. I listened for a while, but there was nothing, just the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the creek. I went inside, locked the door, and told myself it was just the woods settling for the night. But then it happened again the next night. This time I was inside the cabin, reading by lantern light. I had been hearing noises off and on, but I chalked it up to normal night sounds. But then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside. I froze. The door was locked. The windows were shut, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. I reached for my flashlight, hesitated, then decided against it. If someone was out there, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. I waited. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long moment, they started again, moving around the cabin. I held my breath. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They moved carefully, deliberately, like they were checking the place out. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves, but I found disturbances. Places where something had shifted the debris. No clear footprints, but enough to tell me someone had been walking around. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell service, no landline. If I wanted to call for help, I'd have to drive all the way into town. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone curious about the cabin. Maybe a drifter looking for a place to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I brought my hammer inside, keeping it within reach. The sounds came again. The same slow footsteps. The same careful movements. This time, I heard something new. A soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. Someone was touching the walls. I didn't move. I listened, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Silence. Then, a single, deliberate knock on the door. Not a hard knock, not loud, just a slow, measured tap. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't answer. I sat there in the dark, gripping the hammer, listening to the silence stretch out. Then, after a long moment, whoever it was walked away. I heard the footsteps fade into the woods. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided I was done. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to be around to find out. I packed my tools, loaded up my truck, and drove straight into town. I found Raymond at the general store, told him what had happened, and said I was out. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "I'll come with you," he said. We drove back together. When we got to the cabin, it looked the same as I had left it. Nothing disturbed, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, just the quiet valley, the trees, the endless silence. Raymond walked the perimeter, checking the ground, the trees. He didn't say much, just nodded to himself. Finally, he turned to me. "You were right to leave." That was all he said. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. I got in my truck and left. Raymond stayed behind. I never went back to that valley. Never heard from Raymond again. A year later, I heard someone else had been hired to finish the cabin. They left after 2 nights. Didn't say why. Didn't have to. I drove through the thick mist of the backroads, the rain tapping lightly against my windshield. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the world had shrunk down to just me, the road, and the trees stretching endlessly on either side. The headlights barely cut through the fog, casting pale beams against the wet pavement. I was heading toward the old cabin, my wife's cabin, or at least it used to be. It had been a year since she passed. A year of avoiding this road, of staying as far away from this place as I could. But life had a way of pulling me back. The land still had my name on it, and after months of neglect, I had to check on it. The last storm had been rough, and I got a letter from the county about fallen trees. I knew if I put it off any longer, the place would only fall further into ruin. The road leading up to the cabin was worse than I remembered. Potholes deep enough to swallow a tire, gravel scattered unevenly from the last rain. The trees hung low, their branches bare and skeletal. The closer I got, the more the tension in my chest grew. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to step foot inside that cabin. When I finally pulled up, the place looked worse than I expected. The porch sagged, leaves piled up in the corners. The windows were dark, the curtains still drawn like she had left them. Felt wrong to be here alone. I stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of wet wood and rotting leaves. The silence was thick, the only sound coming from my own breathing. I hesitated before unlocking the door. The key felt heavy in my hand, cold from the rain. The moment the lock clicked, a chill ran down my spine. I pushed the door open, and the stale air inside hit me. It smelled exactly the same, like old wood, faint traces of the candles she used to light. Dust had settled over everything, and in the dim light filtering through the window, I could see the fine layer coating the furniture. I walked through the cabin slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The living room was untouched. Her blanket was still draped over the couch, the book she was reading still on the table. I ran a hand over the spine of the book, dust smearing beneath my fingers. I should have packed her things away by now, but I never could. The rain picked up outside, tapping harder against the roof. I made my way to the back of the cabin, checking for leaks, damage, anything that needed fixing. Everything seemed fine until I reached the back door. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the last time I was here. My stomach twisted. Maybe I was remembering wrong. Maybe in my rush to leave the last time I forgot. But still, I reached out and tested the handle. The door creaked open easily, revealing the dark woods behind the cabin. The tree line was close, shadows shifting between the trunks as the wind moved through the branches. I stepped out onto the back porch, my eyes scanning the tree line. Something felt off. The woods had always been quiet, but this was different. The silence was too complete. No birds, no rustling of small animals. Just the rain and the wind. Then something moved. It was quick, just at the edge of my vision. A shadow shifting between the trees. My pulse jumped. I strained my eyes, trying to see if it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A figure. It was standing just beyond the first row of trees, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. A cold sweat broke out along my neck. My first thought was that it was some local, maybe a hunter passing through. But something about the way they stood there, unmoving, sent a deep unease crawling up my spine. I stepped back inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was nothing, just some drifter, someone passing through. But I checked the windows anyway, making sure they were locked. I turned on the lights, pushing back the thick shadows inside the cabin. The rain hammered harder now, the wind picking up. The trees outside swayed violently. Then a sound came from the front porch, a soft creak of wood, like someone shifting their weight. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tensed. There was nothing visible through the front window, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I reached for my truck keys, my mind racing. I had no reason to stay here. Whatever was out there, I wasn't about to wait and find out. I grabbed my things and headed for the door. My heart pounded as I stepped outside, scanning the area quickly before making a break for my truck. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the trees ahead. And that's when I saw him, standing in the middle of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. Tall, unmoving, watching. I couldn't see his face, just the outline of his body against the rain. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, spinning the tires against the wet ground as I backed out, my hands tight on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the cabin long gone in the distance. I never went back. Not long after, I sold the land. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to be rid of it. But sometimes, even now, when I'm driving down a lonely road late at night, I get the feeling again, like someone's watching. And every time, I remember that shadow in the trees, standing, waiting. I never wanted to take the job in the first place. It was an overnight security position at an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The kind of place people stopped visiting years ago, where the headstones were covered in moss and the only thing that kept the land from being reclaimed by the forest was an old man with a lawnmower who came by once a month. But I needed the money, badly. The cemetery had a small caretaker's cabin at the edge of the property. That's where I was supposed to stay during my shift. It was more of a shack than a cabin. 4 walls, a roof, and a door that barely latched. A single cot and a small desk inside. No running water. A battery-powered lantern sat on the desk, but the batteries were nearly dead, so I relied on my own flashlight. I showed up for my first shift just before sundown. The man who hired me barely said a word, just handed me a clipboard with a map of the grounds, told me to check the perimeter twice during my shift, and left in his truck. I stood there watching the taillights disappear down the dirt road, then turned to face the cemetery. The place stretched out in front of me like a sea of stone. The air smelled like damp earth, and the trees lining the property swayed in the wind. It had rained earlier that day, and the ground was still soft beneath my boots. I walked to the cabin, pushing the door open with my shoulder. Inside, it smelled of old wood and mildew. The cot creaked under my weight as I sat down, and I realized just how alone I was out here. I told myself it was just another job. A few hours of walking around, making sure no one had hopped the fence or broken into the mausoleum, and then I'd be gone before sunrise. Easy money, or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd do my rounds, check the fence line, make sure the gates were locked, and then sit in the cabin until my shift ended. The cemetery was silent. Too silent. Not even crickets. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of a branch shifting in the dark. By the 4th night, I had started to relax. I'd even brought a thermos of coffee to keep myself awake. I was halfway through my 2nd round of the night when I noticed something off. One of the graves looked disturbed. It wasn't fresh. There was no dug-up dirt, no open hole, but the ground above the plot seemed uneven, like it had been recently moved. The headstone was old, covered in lichen, and I had to wipe it clean with my sleeve to read the name. I didn't recognize it. I checked my clipboard, but the map didn't have individual graves marked, just general sections. I stood there for a long time, staring at the uneven ground, trying to decide if it was worth reporting. In the end, I made a note of it and moved on. The rest of the night was quiet, but something about that grave stuck with me. The next night, I checked the grave again. It looked the same as before. Uneven, like the dirt had been disturbed, but now I noticed something else. Footprints. They weren't mine. I wore heavy boots, and these were smaller, lighter, like someone had walked through the cemetery barefoot. They led away from the grave, toward the tree line. I followed them with my flashlight, my heart pounding harder with every step. The tracks disappeared into the grass, but I kept my light pointed at the trees, scanning for any movement. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal. The prints didn't look human up close, too wide, too misshapen, but they weren't from any animal I could name. I spent the rest of my shift in the cabin, listening to the wind, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The next night, something changed. I was halfway through my first round when I heard it. A sound. It came from the trees, low and steady. A shuffling, like something moving through the underbrush. I stopped walking and listened. The sound was slow, deliberate. Not the wind, not an animal. Something else. I shined my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only reached so far. Beyond that, just darkness. Then the sound stopped. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting, barely breathing. When nothing happened, I forced myself to keep walking. When I reached the disturbed grave, I saw something new. The footprints were back, and this time they led toward the cabin. I didn't want to go inside, but I had to. The door was still latched. The lantern was still on the desk. Everything looked normal, but when I sat on the cot, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A handprint on the wall. It was smudged, like someone had pressed their palm against the wood and dragged it downward. I ran my fingers over it. The stain was dry. It looked like old dirt, but the shape of the hand was clear. Too clear. I sat there for the rest of my shift, gripping my flashlight, listening. I didn't sleep. The last night, I decided to leave early. I told myself it was paranoia, that the footprints, the handprint, the sounds in the trees, it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I did one final round. The grave looked the same. The footprints were still there. As I made my way back to the cabin, I saw something in the dirt near the door. A single, fresh footprint, larger than the others, and deep, like someone had been standing there, waiting. I stepped inside, latched the door, and waited for sunrise. When my shift ended, I left without looking back. I never went back, never asked about the cemetery, never checked the news. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I never thought I would come back to that cabin. It had been years since I had last seen it, buried deep in the woods, far from any town or highway. But circumstances had brought me back, and now I stood in front of it, staring at the sagging roof, the warped wooden walls, and the windows that seemed too dark, too empty. I was 36 now, older, stronger in some ways, weaker in others. Life had taken its toll. I had spent years working construction, my body worn down from labor. But this place, it still looked the same. The last time I had been here, I was barely 20, a kid who thought he could take on the world. That trip had ended badly. I had barely made it out, and yet here I was again. The cabin belonged to my uncle, or at least it had. He had vanished years ago. No one knew where he had gone. No trace of him was ever found. The official story was that he had wandered off and succumbed to the elements. But people in town whispered other things. That something had happened to him out here. Something no one wanted to talk about. The land had been left to me, along with everything on it. I had ignored it for years, but life had a way of forcing your hand. Work had dried up, and I needed a place to stay. I didn't want to be here, but I had no choice. The first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that only exists deep in the woods, far from people, far from civilization. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. I set up a small fire in the cabin's old fireplace. The chimney was cracked, the bricks crumbling, but it still worked. The place smelled of dust and rot. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked around, checking the corners, making sure there were no animals nesting inside. The furniture was still there. An old wooden table, a few chairs, a couch that had seen better days. My uncle's things were still here too. His clothes in the closet, his boots by the door, his rifle leaning against the wall. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees. The sound of it scraped against my nerves, but it wasn't the wind that bothered me. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. A feeling, a weight pressing down on me, like the air in the cabin was thicker, heavier, like the walls were holding something in. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The woods were dense, the trails overgrown. I followed an old path my uncle had used to hunt, cutting through the underbrush, the cold morning air biting at my skin. I walked for hours, pushing deeper into the forest, trying to clear my head. But the feeling didn't go away. And then I found it. A small clearing hidden away behind a wall of trees. In the center of it, a pile of rocks. At first, I thought it was just some natural formation, but then I saw the way they were stacked, too deliberate, too careful. Like a marker, a grave. Something in me told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I stepped closer, brushing the leaves away. Beneath them, I saw something buried in the dirt, a piece of cloth, and next to it, bone. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a deer, wasn't an animal. The shape was wrong. Human. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. This had to be my uncle. It had to be. But how had he ended up here? Who had buried him? I turned to head back to the cabin, to get my truck and drive into town, to call someone, anyone. But as I moved, I heard it. A branch snapping. Close. Too close. I froze. The air was suddenly heavy, electric with something I couldn't name. I wasn't alone. I scanned the trees, my breath shallow. And then I saw him. A man, half hidden in the shadows, standing between the trunks. Watching me. I didn't move. He didn't either. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other. But then, slowly, he stepped back, melting into the woods. Gone. I ran. I didn't care about the branches cutting at my skin, the roots threatening to trip me. I ran until I reached the cabin, my chest burning. I locked the door behind me, grabbed my uncle's rifle, and sat in the corner, waiting. The night passed in a blur. Every sound outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't sleep, didn't move. The man was out there. I knew he was. Morning came and I made my decision. I wasn't staying here. Whatever had happened to my uncle, I wasn't going to be next. I packed what little I had, grabbed the rifle, and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I made my way to my truck, keeping my eyes on the trees, waiting for movement. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stopped. A fresh set of footprints, right next to the driver's side, leading away back into the woods. He had been here, watching me. I didn't waste another second. I got in, started the engine, and drove. Fast. I didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the land, let someone else deal with it. I never found out who that man was, never knew why my uncle had been buried out there, or what had happened to him. But I know this, someone else did, and they were still out there. I had never been one to believe in bad luck, but sometimes it felt like the world had its way of proving me wrong. That night, I found myself deep in the woods, my truck stuck in the mud on a narrow back road, miles from the nearest town. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the dirt road into a thick mess of wet earth that sucked my tires in deep. I had tried everything, rocking the truck back and forth, throwing down some branches for traction, even getting out and trying to dig around the tires with my bare hands. Nothing worked. I checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising considering how far out I was. I had taken this route as a shortcut to my friend's cabin, but I had clearly underestimated the road conditions after the storm. The only real option I had was to walk. I knew there was an old hunting cabin not too far from here. My friend had mentioned it before, saying it had been abandoned for years. If it was still standing, maybe it could give me shelter for the night. I could figure out what to do in the morning when the rain let up. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket and started walking. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. The rain came down harder, soaking through my clothes as I pushed forward, my boots sinking into the mud with every step. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, the cabin, sitting in the middle of a small clearing. The structure looked old, the wood dark and weathered from years of exposure. The windows were either broken or boarded up, and the door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, but I didn't have a choice. I wasn't going to survive the night in the cold rain. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The inside was exactly what I expected: dusty, damp, and abandoned. There was an old wooden table, a few chairs, and a rusted-out stove in the corner. A small fireplace sat against the back wall, filled with old ash. The smell of rotting wood and mildew filled my nose. At least it was dry. I shut the door behind me and took a few steps inside. My boots echoed against the wooden floor. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Boot prints. Fresh ones. Someone else had been here. Recently. I turned my flashlight toward the floor. The prints led deeper into the cabin, toward a doorway that likely led to a back room or storage space. My heart pounded. Was someone still here? I listened. The wind outside howled. The rain drummed against the roof, but inside, silence. I told myself it was probably an old hunter or another traveler who had taken shelter here earlier. Maybe they had already left. Maybe I was just scaring myself. I kept my flashlight pointed at the doorway as I stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath me. I could feel my own pulse in my throat. The doorway led to a small room. Inside was an old mattress, torn and stained, pile of blankets, an old lantern, and a knife. A large hunting knife sat on the floor near the blankets, its blade glinting in the dim light. This wasn't just some abandoned cabin. Someone was living here, and I had just walked into their home. My breath came fast and shaky. I turned quickly, moving back toward the main room. My mind raced. What if they were still here, watching me? I needed to leave. Now, I reached for the door handle. Then I heard it. A noise, soft, from outside. Footsteps in the mud. I froze. My grip tightened around the flashlight. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I just stood there, listening as the footsteps came closer. Someone was out there. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness. I moved away from the door, pressing myself against the wall. I barely breathed. The footsteps reached the porch. I heard the wooden boards groan under the weight. Then silence. I knew they were out there, standing just beyond the door. I stayed still. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. I waited. Then the door creaked open. A dark figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the night. Tall, broad shoulders, a hood covering their face. They took a step forward. I clenched my fists. I needed a weapon. Anything. My eyes darted around the room, adjusting to the darkness. The chair, the rusted stove, the knife in the back room. The figure moved deeper inside, their breathing heavy. I stepped backward, my foot brushing against something on the floor. A metal rod, maybe part of the old stove. The noise made them stop. They turned their head sharply. I could feel their eyes on me in the dark. Then they moved fast. I barely had time to react before they lunged. I grabbed the metal rod and swung wildly. It connected with something, an arm or a shoulder. The figure grunted but didn't go down. I turned and ran. I sprinted toward the back room, grabbing the knife off the floor. I spun just in time to see the figure charging after me. I didn't think. I just reacted. I drove the knife forward. It sunk into something solid. The figure let out a low, guttural sound and staggered back. I didn't wait. I pushed past them, running for the door. I bolted outside into the rain, my boots slipping in the mud. I ran. I didn't look back. The woods swallowed me, My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept going. I didn't know if they were following. I didn't care. I just ran. I didn't stop until I saw the faint outline of my truck through the trees. I scrambled inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands shook as I tried to catch my breath. My body was soaked, my heart still racing. I waited, watching. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Nothing. Whoever they were, they hadn't followed me. The storm eventually passed, and as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I tried my engine one last time. Coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. I didn't waste another second. I floored it, the truck jerking free from the mud. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just drove. I never found out who that person was. I never told anyone what happened. But I knew one thing for sure. That cabin wasn't abandoned, and I was never supposed to leave it alive.